This week's video blog is focusing on transition. We've come to that time in the academic year when, if all things were normal, which we know they're not, we would be considering transition for students. We'd be beginning to think about which form they'll be in, which class they'll be in next year, who their teachers will be, and so on. This is something which is considered for all children, but in particular for special needs, and we'd start to think about preparing our special needs children for whatever next year is going to be. So if they're a year 5 child, we'd want them to see the difference between a year 5 classroom, a year 6 classroom. If they're going from maybe infants to juniors, going across a key stage, then we'd want to have something which would help them to recognise the new environment, to be familiar with the new environment. And there's all sorts of ways we do that. Transition is just the way we prepare everyone for the changes. It's the changes that happen. Now, for some children with with stronger special educational needs, we might need to, for example, give preparation for lesson transition. Going from primary school to secondary school, the transition is much bigger because you're going from quite often having one main teacher who's there most of the time to having several different teachers, and sometimes the teachers do come to you, but more often than not in a secondary school you then have to transition yourself between each lesson. You have to go from one classroom to another classroom across the school, and these are very important transition plans that we normally create. This year, the reason I'm focusing on it, it's been trending a bit on Twitter, and it's actually more significant than ever because we're not just transitioning for our special needs children, for our between the key stage children and so on. All children are transitioning from a time of lockdown and virtual learning, or sometimes no learning, to being back in school. At some point we will return to school, and those transitions need to be considered. So the reason I'm discussing this now is so that transitions are very much a part of people's awareness at the moment. They're very much aware of that for both children, parents, teachers and school leaders. We all need to be aware of transition. The transitions are not just going to affect the pupils, they're going to affect teachers too. There are going to be teachers who haven't been inside a school for a term, more than a term. And for some, that will have its own anxiety. I think it's easy to forget that teachers too get anxious. Throughout my entire teaching career, I always had, and this is a very experienced teacher here, but I always had that slight Monday morning feeling throughout, and after a school holiday, I used to love insets because that used to gradually take me back into school, and I found it easier when the children arrived. I was ready, I was in the right place for it. So that's an experienced teacher. So for those lesser experienced teachers, sorry about that, the anxiety could be higher. So we need to consider their anxiety as well as that of the children. We also need to consider so many aspects. There are children who, since they've been off school, being homeschooled in whatever form and to whatever extent that has taken, their anxiety has gone down. Things have been more predictable. There have been fewer meltdowns. I know that's not true for all. There are children on the spectrum who have actually found it very confusing and they can't cope with the idea of any learning at home because learning's what happens at school, and I've spoken to a lot of parents about how that can be managed. However, transitioning into school from home is going to require considerable consideration. I don't have all the answers here, there isn't time to say them all here, but things to be considered. The pace of returning to school itself. There was some suggestion, which I found horrendous, that children will come back and have an extended day, they'll have more time in school to catch up on all the work they've missed. Personally, I find that horrendous. Children who have been off school for however many months it will be by the time they return, they need a reduced day, they need a gradual reintegration, not a sudden you're back and you're back doing more than you ever did. So we need to consider the pace of return And then the pace within the school, because the pace of learning at home will be very different from the pace of learning usually in school. The expectations, there's going to be a huge gap between children. There will be children who have been at home and been, if you like, hothouse. They've been, studying this and this fairly intensely at home. There'll be others who've hardly done anything, and there'll be everything in between. So that there's going to be a very wide gap between children for whom we thought we knew what the gaps were and everything. So our expectations need to allow for these differences and be flexible rather than rigid. Oh, this is a child who's at this ability. What will they have retained? What will they have learned new? What will they have unlearned? What will they want to do differently? Our expectations and theirs need careful consideration. So we need to ensure that we have strategies to support them. We need that in the actual way we plan the transition and in what is in place when they return to school. How are we going to cope with children who suddenly have a shorter attention span than they had before the lockdown? These are things we need to consider. So our expectations go along with our awareness. We need a heightened awareness. We need to be looking out for signs that things aren't quite as they seem or as they were, so that we can pick up on things quickly before they become too stressful. It's really important to reduce that stress. It's going to be very high stress for teachers as well as for pupils when they come back. Now, technology is a big part of how we reintegrate people and how we do a transition anyway. Quite often people will do either a video or a photo sort of diary thing of what to expect, so that over the summer a child can look at it and be familiar with the routines that they will be facing when they transition as they go back. So for those with technology at home, we can do Zoom meetings or Skype or whichever platform we're using. Microsoft Teams, there's a Google one, there's all sorts of platforms. Whatever it is we're using, we could use that to actually speak face to face, as it were, with the children, so they get to know who they'll be returning to. So we can use that. We can, for those who don't have the technology, we can go into schools and take photos so they know what the environment is going to be, their specific environment. Now, we might want to do more detailed ones for children with, for example, who are on the autistic spectrum, or who have dyspraxia, or who have sensory needs, whatever speech language communication needs. We may want to do more detailed ones for them, but it might be helpful to generally have something that we can then put out to all children, because there'll be children who will not have been in school for months, and for some who we haven't previously thought of as having anxiety issues, this could become a very anxious time. So we need to think about how we can use technology, use what we have to reach people and help them to transition. We also need to have some interprofessional dialogue, because we would normally pass on information so that, for example, just between classes, teachers talk to each other. Teachers say, oh, when you get this class, be aware that this one sitting with this one has been an issue. May not be an issue when they come back, but just be aware of that. Be aware of this strategy. There's that dialogue that teachers need to know what is coming towards them. But between schools, as in if you're going to a different school or a different key stage, that dialogue needs to be more detailed. There needs to be some form of transition plan, not only so the child knows what to expect, but so the teacher knows what is expected of them and what is coming to them in terms of what needs they're going to be dealing with within the classroom. And there also needs to be this interdialogue between schools and parents. There are going to be parents who are extremely anxious about their children returning to school. They may find that actually since the lockdown we've had fewer meltdowns, fewer sensory issues, fewer concerns. Do I want my child to go back into a school? How do I know my child will feel safe? How do I know my child will cope? So that dialogue is really important. and for the children themselves, dialogue. So we need dialogue between teachers and parents, teachers and children, parents and children, and within all this, the senior leadership of the school need to be very much involved. So I don't have all the answers. What I'm saying is these are questions we should be asking ourselves and saying what is appropriate in our context, because every school is different, every child is different, every situation is different. These are things, as I say, that schools consider every year and sometimes every term. These are normal considerations for teachers, but this year they take on other layers, and these layers need to be recognised and addressed if people are going to go back to school and feel comfortable, safe and settled. And as I say, that's the teachers as well as the pupils. It's easy to think, oh yes, the teachers will just all come back, and they will have been working differently, different pace, different environment, and they may also be just a little bit apprehensive about coming back to school. So whenever it happens, whenever the transition to whatever normal is, we need to have these things thought about, considered and addressed beforehand. We can't wait until we all suddenly go back and we get told we're going back to school in 2 weeks' time, because that doesn't give us time to address these things. And we would normally be addressing them for September. If we go back to school before September, they will need to be addressed before September, because it will be a transition. And that, I can't emphasise enough just how important that is, how significant it is for people moving from one situation to another. Thank you.